Let's get underway. My name's Cary Coglianese. Here's my understanding of the technology, and I've got two technicians in the room with me now, and they can correct me if I'm mistaken. But we should all be able to speak to each other, and as long as you turn on the audio, we'll be able to hear you. You can then certainly ask questions of me or raise questions for others to hear and to think about. What I will plan to do is give some opening remarks using slides, and we'll toggle over to the slides in a moment. And then I'll give that presentation, and then we'll open it up for some comments by other members of the National Academy of Sciences Committee, and you will then be invited to ask any questions and have any discussion. At the outset, I see that Detlof van Winterveld is on from a remote location. He is the chair of this committee. Detlof, would you like to say anything at all at the outset before we get underway?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. I'm calling in from Tulum, Mexico, and you're keeping me from a beautiful beach here. So I'm looking forward to that wonderful presentation by Cary.
Thank you very much, Detlof. Sorry to keep you from your beach. If we can toggle to the slides now. I have a few slides that I hope will help clarify the purpose of our meeting in just a week or so, and in January 4th and 5th in The Hague. And our objectives today is to help prepare for that meeting, and to provide some general background on the study committee on performance-based safety regulation. I'm going to introduce the taxonomy of regulatory approaches that we have been discussing and grows out of research on regulatory instrument design, specifically distinguishing between regulation, management or system regulation, and performance regulation.
Hello, this is Jens Hoffmark.
Welcome aboard. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
A fourth objective will be to provide guidance to those of you on the connection now, or who will be watching this video at a later time in preparation for the meetings. If you are giving a presentation to the committee, I'll offer a few thoughts and guidance about those presentations. And then, as mentioned, I'll have an opportunity for questions and discussion. Now, I've noticed at the outset a lot of background noise. Would it be helpful if people put their connections on mute for now? If they can mute their microphones, and then we wouldn't have background noise. Are others hearing the background noise?
Yeah,
Yes.
Robin, I like your sign. I think I'm going to have to make one of those myself.
Okay, so just a little bit of background on the committee. There are about 14 members of the committee, and I've listed their names here. Half of the committee will be present at the meeting in The Hague, and most all of those members are with us on this connection now. And as I said, I'll invite them to say some words after my opening remarks. I should note at the outset a general caveat that I am speaking here mainly on my own behalf. I'm trying to reflect what I see as the objectives of the committee and the work that we've been doing. But I don't want to claim that I am speaking on behalf of any other committee member, and I'm not intending to share any conclusions because the committee hasn't made any, and nothing I'm going to say should be construed as any conclusion or determination on the part of the committee itself. Okay, so what is the scope of the overall project that the committee is engaged in? This is just to give you a highlight of the big picture of what we're looking at. We're charged with comparing the advantages and disadvantages of prescriptive and performance-based forms of safety regulation. We're focused primarily in high-hazard industries when we're looking in particular at offshore oil and gas, which is the focus of the meeting, but also on pipelines and other regulations. By performance-based safety regulation, I'll get into this a little bit more in depth in a moment, but the committee means both standards that actually and how to meet those management systems that require regulated entities develop internal plans and procedures and practices for promoting safety and reducing risk. So we're going to encompass both of those understandings. At the outset, I should indicate my own view is that all regulation is performance-based in the sense that it is and should be aimed at improving performance, particularly when we're dealing with safety risks. The aim of all regulation, no matter what form it takes, should be to reduce risk and improve safety performance. That said, we mean by performance-based regulation something a little bit more specific than that general platitude, if you will. But I think that's an important thing to note at the outset, that everything really should be aimed at performance. What we have been looking at as a way of organizing our work and our interest is a topology of regulatory instruments. This is an example of the topology that we have referred to in our work. This grows out of some work that I have produced. And it is designed to distinguish between regulatory standards that are very specific and prescriptive about what a regulated entity must do versus other approaches that give regulated entities a greater degree of flexibility in achieving the ultimate objective of the regulation. And I'd like to just spend a minute or two to walk through this 2x2 table, and in part because what we hope that you can do at the meeting that we have at The Hague is come to us with some examples of regulatory requirements that you might either be charged with enforcing if you're a regulator, or you might be subject to trying to comply with if you are a regulated firm. And we're interested in hearing some examples from your own work in the oil and gas exploration and development sector in the North Sea, how some of these different types of regulations are working or not working, what the challenges are associated with them. So let me start by taking a look at the upper left cell of this matrix. Here, what we are looking at are regulations that are telling companies actual actions or steps or activities or equipment that they must install. And this is to recognize that really regulations can do one of two things. They can tell firms what to do, or they can tell firms what outcomes to achieve. So this 2x2 matrix is divided first into two columns, means versus ends. And we're looking here at what the regulation is actually demanding of the regulated firm. So in the upper left cell, we have often referred to as prescriptive regulation, sometimes referred to as design standards, technology standards, sometimes command and control regulation. The point being that in this, this type of rule would be telling regulated entities exactly what to do, to install and operate, what pollution control devices to use. We'd like to see, you know, how that approach compares with some of the others. Let me compare that going across the top row to the upper right cell now to what are often called performance standards. But there's other different types of terms, outcome standards or the like. Here, there's no requirement for a regulated firm to adopt any particular equipment or act in any particular way, but rather simply to achieve an outcome that has been determined by the regulator. And a failure to meet that is subject to some kind of response by the regulator. These performance standards are often justified because they give firms flexibility to determine the most cost-effective way of going about achieving the outcome. So we have at the top row very specific means in the upper left, very specific outcomes in the upper right. I want to move down to the lower row in this chart and look at the left side, which reflects what we call, and I think we've been referring to regularly as management or management. Here, management system requirement that a facility has to go through a process internally of identifying hazards and developing response plans for addressing those hazards. This is sometimes, I'm sure, in some of the regulations that you are involved in, referred to as safety case regulation or systems management regulation. There's the bottom right cell, I'll just say briefly, is performance-based in that it requires companies to avoid catastrophes and accidents, and then it operates after the fact by imposing liability when an accident occurs. We are not spending a lot of time on that, but we certainly would be open to discussion. I will say that the difference in the bottom row between management-based and what is labeled here meta-performance standards, again goes to the means and the distinction. In a management-based regulatory approach, there are actual steps and actions that a regulated firm must undertake to comply with the regulation, but those steps are steps related to management, to planning and identifying hazards and developing their own internal responses. Let's move to this next slide just briefly to highlight how these different, 4 different regulatory approaches can be thought of as yielding different amounts of flexibility for a regulated firm. This is simply a very simple model of how a company might form at the very left of this slide and begin to make decisions, and then they engage in some behavior. In this example of a power plant producing electricity, they're going to be maybe burning coal, producing electricity, and that, as you move farther to the right, pollution, and that pollution, as you move all the way to the far right, results in harm to human health. if a performance standard is set at the very far right of this diagram, what it implies is that everything to the left is open for the regulated firm to engage in different activities and have a great deal of tremendous amount of flexibility, as opposed to, if you look at the second from the left step in this chain, if a regulation requires a particular means, either changing to a low sulfur power fuel, or installing some pollution equipment, there the firm actually has very little flexibility left, because they no longer have what to choose. The regulation is telling them exactly the means to undertake. This is simply another way that I think in our discussions we found it helpful to realize that there are consequences to which type of regulatory approach is taken, consequences in terms of the degree of flexibility that regulated entities themselves have to determine the best way to achieve a regulatory outcome and the performance that the regulation is aiming at. Now, even though what I've developed here and presented are 4 major archetypes of different regulatory strategies, I think it's important to recognize that not all management standards are the same. So if we're looking just in that lower left corner of this 2x2 matrix for now, even though we've put a lot of, we could put a lot of different regulatory regimes into that lower left, they're not all the same. How can they differ? Some require just planning, that is, just that firms go about identifying safety hazards and developing plans to address them. Others, other regulatory regimes require planning and the implementation and following of those plans, and that's an important difference. We see differences in management standards in terms of the level of specificity or precision in management criteria. There would be a big difference between a management regime that says reduce hazards and then one that actually specifies which hazards, which kinds of things to be looking at, and what a good management plan would require. There's different roles for the regulator in the planning process. As I'm sure you all know, some regulations require that the regulator actually pre-approve the plans that are required. Some differences in terms of record keeping and transparency of the management plans. And there's also differences in the extent to which a management-based regulatory approach is supplemented with or interacting with other types of regulation. So some management plans come along with, even though you have to come up with an overall plan to reduce fire safety hazards, there's still a requirement that every facility have fire extinguishers on board, which would be a means-based regulation. Lots of regulations are operating in tandem or in hybrids. Similarly, when we look at performance standards, if we're to go back here to the upper right corner for a moment, if we go there, not all performance standards are the same. Sometimes the outcomes that are mandated are highly specific, no more than 0.07 parts per million of a pollutant can be emitted, versus others that are relatively loose, do not create any unreasonable hazard, would be an example of a loose specificity. There's a difference in performance standards in the proximity between the outcome that's actually mandated and the regulatory goal. And this is, again, is the standard set in terms of public health, or is an air pollution standard, say, set in terms of emissions from a facility? There's going to be some differences there. How performance is determined. Some performance standards are monitored through actual measurements. Others are through computer simulation predicted values. Is the basis for the standard what is ideal or what is feasible? Is performance to be measured at an individual level, at each individual smokestack, or at the aggregate of the overall emissions, say, coming out of an overall facility? Who bears the burden of proof that performance has been met? Does the regulator have to show that the regulated entity has failed to meet the required performance, or does the regulated firm have to come forward and demonstrate that? These are all differences that come to mind in thinking about management standards and performance standards, which we're very interested in. And these differences could affect how well a management or a performance standard approach will operate in practice. So we're interested in hearing if you have any insights in the details of your regulatory approaches along some of these lines. Let me also highlight a few other issues of interest to us in particular that I hope can come forward in our discussions at The Hague. We're interested in this question about combining management or performance regulation with means or prescriptive regulation. Do you find that you have a combination? Are facilities subject to both kinds of regulatory approaches or multiple kinds of regulatory approaches? And how does that combination play out? When does it work well? When doesn't it work so well? We're obviously also interested in thinking about how best to design a regulatory approach. For example, when it comes to performance standards, one question is, how do you test and determine performance? Is it through in-use testing, through simulations, laboratory testing? When it comes to management standards, again, is it better just to require the planning or the planning and implementation of plans? How specific should required management steps be? These are design considerations that interest us, and we'd like to hear from you about your experience. We're also very much interested in thinking through implementation challenges with performance standards. How frequently should you test? Who should do the auditing? Do you involve third parties in auditing on outcomes? When it comes to management standards, a host of issues in implementation. How do you make sure your inspectors have the capabilities of evaluating good quality safety management? What do you do to build a capable inspector force to look at that? What indeed are the criteria for assessing management quality? You know that someone is actually operating and managing in a responsible manner. We're also interested in evaluation challenges. What kind of data do you rely on to evaluate how well a regulatory system is working? Are there special issues in doing regulatory impact analysis for performance standards or for management standards? And how do you think about when we have these hybrids or combinations where there's multiple approaches being used, how do you think through evaluating those hybrids? Okay, so those are just some broad issues of interest. I hope they give you a flavor for what we have been thinking about and talking about and what interests us. Let me turn to some suggested guidance for those of you who will be offering us some presentations at the Hague meeting. The first suggestion is please come to us with examples. Very specific examples would be helpful to us. We really would like to get into the weeds on what you are doing. Maybe to keep things a little bit focused, we could try to focus more on the operational safety of oil and gas facilities. I know there's a whole host of regulatory approaches to the development of drilling and establishment of platforms, and all of that is very important too. But just in the interest of our time, we thought maybe we would encourage us to focus more on the day-to-day operation of oil and gas facilities. If you could, we would really appreciate if you could try to detail at least one example from each of the three main types of regulation that I've focused on: a means or prescriptive approach, a management or systems approach, or performance or outcomes approach. With respect to each of those examples that you could come forward, here are some questions that we would be particularly interested in hearing about from you. Very much interested in how firms manage compliance and how regulators learn about how firms are doing. How is compliance monitored and assessed, particularly when it comes to these more flexible approaches of regulation, whether performance standards or management standards? How is variation across different firms or in different local conditions? How is that factored in or addressed? What particular capabilities or capacities do these different regulatory approaches demand of regulators in their autonomy, their staff competencies, their funding sources? How about for the regulated industry? What technical and performance standards, what do they mean for the demands that are placed upon industry? These are just a few of the range of questions we hope to invite you to consider for us. I mean, other possible questions of interest to us: what happens when an incident does occur? Do you have an investigation process? How does that investigation process relate to or connect to your understanding of your regulatory approach? What are the different influences that your country's political, legal, institutional, cultural norms and frameworks play? What are the relationships between government, the private sector, contractors, labor unions, auditors? Do you rely on third-party auditors? And what's the role of collaboration in both setting and enforcing your regulations? We'd love to also think through any issues about coping with resilience in the face of changing risks and technologies that you might be facing. So a lot of questions that we have. In the interest of focusing our time together, I've urged these four that are here as starting points for our discussion, and hope that this overall presentation has helped give you a flavor for what we are thinking about and interested in. At this point, in what remains, I just have first to ask all of the other members of the committee who are on if they would like to add anything to what I have presented. And then we will open it up for questions and discussion from anyone else in the remaining time that we have. So why don't I go through our committee members here and ask first if our committee chair, Detloff, if you have anything that you would like to add following this. I'll invite Susan. I saw that you were on. Anyone else from the committee, please.
Thank you, Cary. Let me just thank you very much for an excellent overview of what we're doing and what we are after in terms of our meeting in Den Haag. I only want to make one additional point. In our process looking at standards and regulations in the safety area, we found that there is a bit of a confusion between what regulators and regulated industries call performance standards or performance regulations and what are called management-based regulations. So to the extent that you can clarify that distinction to us, that would be very helpful. And with that, I'll turn it over to the other committee members to chime in.
Okay, so thank you very much, Detloff. Susan, did you have anything?
Well, you did a wonderful summary of our thinking up to the point in our search for more wisdom. I would just like to emphasize that we are interested in their experiences as particular as possible on these questions. And I am interested in finding out how much flexibility they have, believe they have, or enact with regard to local conditions and the different circumstances of different firms. Now, I imagine in the North Sea, there are not a lot of small, maybe I'm wrong, small independent companies. But do they have experience of dealing with small companies and large companies? Well, let us say resourced companies versus others which are not. And do they have the flexibility to adjust their implementation and inspections, etc., to the local conditions? That's one of my concerns. My other concern is how they develop their policies. Do they use experiments in the field to actually test whether certain kinds of policies or implementation strategies are more or less successful, or different standards? I'm interested in that because this has become the standard now, the gold standard for all sorts of public policy in all kinds of fields, ranging from, if I can be so banal as kindergarten, early education, to major issues of poverty worldwide or the economy and financial regulation. So I'm interested in what kind of processes they use to come up with their own regulatory standards. I'll leave it to Robin, who I think has some other questions, and I'll leave them to her.
Robin, shall we turn to you? You will not be able to join us in The Hague, but I would invite you as a member of the committee, by all means, to share your thoughts.
Okay, so hello, everybody. I actually didn't print out what I had written to your committee, to the subcommittee, but the general idea was, actually, let me just leave it. Let me look up, come back to me and I'll look up exactly what I wrote.
All right, great. Rachel, I see that you're on. Is there anything you would like to add?
There we go. If I can figure out how to unmute myself. Hello, everybody. It's Rachel. Just a really quick comment from me, just to emphasize the point that Cary made about if you're trying to answer these questions, please try to focus on very specific examples rather than talking generally. I think that's going to really help us as committee members in pulling together our conclusions and our recommendations. And I look forward to seeing everyone in The Hague in the new year.
Thank you. Ken Arnold, are you on?
Yes, I am. I think you did a wonderful job in outlining what we're looking for. What I'm specifically would like to see from the industry representatives is how do they design things differently and operate differently because of the different kinds of regimes. In particular, looking at North Sea kind of regime versus the Gulf of Mexico regime. I'm not all that interested in hearing from them, how they document what they do differently. What I really want to know is, what do they do differently? How do they behave differently? How do they come up with different well designs or different platform designs or facilities designs, that type of thing.
Excellent. Thank you. Tom, our staff officer, would you like to add?
No, I don't, except I do want to thank all the participants. I've emailed you all, and it's nice to see some of the faces. I don't have anything substantive to add, but I'm certainly looking forward to hearing from you all in a couple weeks.
Thank you. Robin, can we come back to you now?
Okay, yeah. So now I have an email in front of me rather than your faces. So, so basically, when I was, we were asked from our committee, you know, do we have any suggested other questions? So one possible other question that I had was if people could comment on issues, if there are any, in dealing with companies with multinational global operations crossing different regulatory jurisdiction boundaries, if there's particular challenges. And then maybe another one about their perceptions of problems, if there are any, that the US approach or the approach by their neighboring countries or jurisdictions are using. So it's sort of in the same spirit of if there's special challenges crossing different jurisdictions. Maybe one jurisdiction has narrow prescriptive regulations and then another one has broad performance-based standards. How do companies deal with this? And then people commented, and I'll just say a couple of the comments that I saw. Well, one point was that when there's ownership change, actually this is Rachel's comments, so maybe she could say it a little bit more, but it was talking about if somebody buys a company and they come into an arena where they're not used to working in that regulatory framework, was one follow-up question. And then another broader question from Lois Epstein was for offshore operators, how do they make decisions about entering new arenas since more factors than just the regulatory framework are involved? This industry may be different than others since they need to go where the supplies are, the oil and gas supplies are, and maybe regulatory jurisdiction rules are not a barrier for them entering into a new area.
Excellent. Have I missed anybody from the committee who is on the call at this point who would like to speak up? If not, thank you to my colleagues on the committee for those clarifying comments. I think as those others of us on the listening to all of this probably imagine, we have lots of questions and lots of things that we're interested in. Let us turn this now over to you for any comments, questions that you may have for us in preparation for the meeting in The Hague. And I see that Tap Powell has a question, so please, if you could introduce yourself at the outset, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cary. Tap Powell Corporate Integrity Partnership, recently with the IDC, before that with the European Commission, before that with the UK, before that with BP. One point really is that the 2x2 taxonomy that you offer, is quite interesting, and I'm sure we can all try and fit around it, but the missing word, I think, of the North Sea is risk. So the regimes in the North Sea that you put on display for you will be risk-based, and therefore sort of trying to, a safety case regime is actually separate from safety management system. And I think these things need explaining and clarifying. But they're operating differently because the new rules in Europe were a directive acting on regulators, not acting directly on industry, and therefore you have to turn something from saying member states will ensure that the company does this, have to be then translated by the member state into a regulation of its own. So they've all turned out a little differently. That's going to be very interesting. But just to manage the expectations of your very distinguished panel, I haven't heard the word risk at all today or seen it printed, but that's going to, if you like, be a very common term, I think, in the discussions that you'll have in The Hague, which I'm looking forward to tremendously. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. I can give you my own response to that, as certainly, again, stepping back in the big picture, any type of regulatory approach related to safety risks, and that's what we are very much focused on, will be very much concerned about risk, right? So then the question is, where does risk fit into this whole picture? Risk can be used as, first of all, the broader objective that any regulatory strategy is going to address, but it also can be used as the basis for selecting and designing a regulatory strategy within the topology that I laid out. For example, if you're in the upper left cell where you're dealing with traditional command and control regulation, that can be risk-based in the sense that a regulator could say, well, do we require the installation of this piece of safety equipment or this piece of safety equipment? And we're going to make our decision about which means to require on the basis of risk and which mandated technology would actually reduce risk the most, let's say. That's just one way. Now, if you get to a performance standard, you could actually define the obligation in some risk term. A facility must operate with no more than X level of incidents or accidents or injury rates. That would be a way of defining a performance target that's mandatory in risk terms. In the lower left, the management approach could say, well, we want to see you, the regulated facility, come up with a strategy that's aimed at addressing these risks. So I think we could say in a certain way that all of these approaches could be risk-based. It's just how risk factors in could be quite different. Obviously, some of what we all face in our own spheres of work are different terms that sometimes are addressing the same thing, and sometimes similar terms that are addressing different things. And I would appreciate your comment and appreciate any further insight that you have now, or anyone else now, or at the meeting in The Hague, about how risk factors into and affects the regulatory strategies that we're talking about. Baba?
Yeah. Baba is my computer name. My name is Paul. I'm from Petroleum Safety Authority. Thank you for this very, very comprehensive and good introduction to a coming seminar. I really appreciate that you have done such good work up front to a seminar. I would imagine this will be the most empowered people I ever have been talking to. So I really look forward to that event. Since I am going to give the introductory presentation at Hague, I'm sitting here and trying to think and reflect actually how we should approach, because I miss out, as was said here about the risk, I also miss out one phase, and that is the complexity. Mm-hmm. I was asked this spring to review the volume 5 of the Macondo report, covering the different regulatory regimes around the world. They were comparing different regulatory regimes, and they kept referring to performance-based risk and performance-based regulations. But nevertheless, the story is that the complexity within these different systems also makes them very distinct, different. So it's very different. If you look at the UK safety case system and the Norwegian performance-based or management-based system, well, they are quite different also. And I was commenting that the report didn't reflect this complexity. So my concern when I get to Hague is that we have very, very little time to dig into this complexity. I'm a lucky man because Norway has an aid program, so we call it Oil for Development, and it brings me around the world to advise countries, particularly third world countries, actually how they should put up a regulatory regime for the oil and gas. So I have a lot of experience from countries around, and I will share with you a lot of dilemmas as I see that due to this cultural or institutional aspects which needs to come into a system, and also which put a lot of complexity into the system. So, but what I have been seeing today, this is so exciting because normally I only talk about these things in the intimate family setting, not the regulatory setting, not as such. So this seems to be a very good event coming up. But nevertheless, we need also to keep in mind that the expectations of digging into the deepest shouldn't be too high.
Right.
But I really look forward to the event.
Thank you very much. I certainly agree. We have only 2 days, and we hope to, through this webinar, aim to help us make it the most of that limited time that we have. I appreciate that. I have a raised hand here from Gert-Jan.
Yeah, that's correct. Hello. It's indeed very interesting what I'm hearing, and looking forward to it. I'm missing a little bit one element. I'm from the National Oil Industry Association in the Netherlands, NOGEPA, but previously did some work more worldwide and have some experience in this. The culture effect. What we usually said is that although North Sea legislation is on many things it has the same standards because we go from the same European legislation nowadays. It doesn't mean that UK legislation will work in the Netherlands and the other way around, because we've got a different culture, how we approach things as a country, as people, same like the Norwegians. Some people want to have things written down in detail. Other people have it's good enough half a word. And I think the more you travel around the world, the more of these things you will see. TAF will probably agree with that. So I believe also that one of the elements what we should discuss or mention in the Hague is how local culture influences, especially the way how you work with each other, how you cooperate. And knowing in the US, probably people from let's say the Northeast will probably be a little bit different than the people I meet in Dallas.
Exactly. Very well taken, and indeed an important issue for us to consider. Thank you. Invite any other comments from committee members or any other members of this phone call.
Yeah, this is Jens Hoffmark from the International Association of Drilling Contractors. Could you give me a little background of who took the initiative to form this committee, and what is the ultimate objective you are seeing for the meeting in Hague?
Excellent question. I'll briefly give you my take, and then I'll invite, I think, Tom from the National Academy staff to add to that. The project is part of National Academy of Sciences Transportation Board. It has been commissioned by the United States Department of Transportation. And ultimately, what we're aiming for is a report that will be prepared in the coming year, detailing findings that we have made and frankly, kind of a laying out of a framework that we've been working through, I anticipate, about the advantages and disadvantages and the considerations that have to go into choosing from among the different performance-based approaches to regulation, the performance standards or management standards in particular, and how to think about what will make those approaches successful and less successful. Tom, I would ask if you have anything further you want to add. Maybe you could even explain a little bit about the genesis of this particular meeting in The Hague and how it fits in.
Okay, just a little background on the study. I think some of you have mentioned this too, is it's funded by the Department of Transportation, particularly the Pipeline Safety Office, because they've been trying over the years to move in the direction of what they call performance-based standards. And every time there's an incident in the U.S., they inevitably go before Congress, a major incident, and Congress will say, why aren't you telling the pipeline operators how to ensure safety? So there's a pressure to be more prescriptive, and the regulators believe that to be effective, they need to be more performance-oriented. So the DOT has asked us to put together this distinguished panel to look not just in the pipeline sector, and I know some of you actually do regulate pipelines, so would be interested in hearing that as well, but also to look more broadly where there's been quite a bit of experience in other forms of regulation that are less prescriptive. They like to call their standards performance standards. Cary is distinguished between performance and management-based. And in particular, we know, of course, the North Sea has a long history of moving away from prescriptive standards. So we thought, in fact, we've been asked to look internationally. And so that's, of course, the main purpose of us going to the North Sea, is to learn from your experience. And so we're hoping this report is a broadly based report. It doesn't just focus on specific industries, but can be used by regulators who regulate high hazard industries, whether it's chemical, pipeline, offshore oil and gas, or others. And so we want to bring in rich case studies like talking to you all, but we'd also like to make sure that the audience is a much broader audience.
Does that
anyway,
help, Ian?
That's sort of the background. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Excellent question. Does anyone else have a question or a comment?
Hello, it's Paul Bradley from the UK. Due to present, mine's a little around the sort of logistics of the day, and I see from the agenda and the programme we've sort of been allocated a 40-minute slot. How hard and fast is that? Is that sort of half and half presentation, half time for questions? Just some guidance on what the expectations are. And to date, I must say it's been very well organised, and the information presented in such a way that it's made it a lot easier to consider what we need to put into the presentations.
Well, thank you very much for that and for the question. I'm going to pass that along to Tom as well, as he's been spearheading the various logistical and scheduling arrangements to see if he has further thoughts. I think one thing that he will say is that we will be, I think, pushing out some additional details about these sorts of things in the coming days as well. Tom?
Right. I've been looking at the agenda and talking with some of the committee members. There seems to be a preference for allowing you all more time. So right now I'm going to be making some adjustments to the agenda And what I'd like to do is at least put one or two of the presentations that are now scheduled before, and this is on the first day, before lunch, to move them, at least one of them perhaps, to the afternoon, so we can even have more time with examples from the regulatory agencies. The way we've set it up is we have a large roundtable discussion at the end of the day in the early afternoon to mid-afternoon. So I would see a lot of the discussion occurring at that time, but we understand that there'll be a need for discussion in each case. So I would count on maybe having about 50 minutes each, and if we could maybe shoot for 30 minutes of presentation and allow the rest 20 minutes or so for discussion, I think that, at least that's what I think would work. Committee members may have different preferences. I'll make some slight adjustments to the agenda and send that out either today or tomorrow. And so you can see any reflection of discussion today.
Tom, yeah, thank you. That answers my question. Just a little caveat around the examples. People or organisations tend to get a little upset with us disclosing their mishaps, shall we say. So we'll try and anonymise them as much as we can, but make them relevant, and that may be difficult.
We know in a way we're asking a lot. It's a busy time of year for so many of us, and we're coming together right after the holiday season. We hope that you'll just try your best. And again, we intended this discussion here online, and if anybody's watching it, just we're going to record it, and people can watch it at their leisure too. We hope that this is helpful, at least in making things easier, not harder for everybody, but easier. We hope so. Any other comments or questions that people may have?
And I just want to add on a logistical note. I've mentioned a couple times that it would be nice if everyone could participate in both days. And I know several of you are, and we are going to have a reception on the first night, and there's another opportunity for you all to talk informally to committee members. So to the extent that the industry folks can come in on the first day and be part of the discussion with the regulators and vice versa, I think that will make the discussion all that much better.
Yeah, I think it may be reflected in the materials as well that Tom has already sent, that the meetings themselves will be open, and certainly in light of your last comment or question about anonymizing the like, just be aware, obviously, that in addition to whatever you share with the committee, it will be in some sense possible that others will be involved in observing the meeting as well. Any other questions or comments? Invite any of our committee members who haven't have any other thoughts as we close, and then I'll ask our chair if he has any final words.
I'm back on. So, well, thank you very much, Cary. Thanks everybody for showing up today, and I certainly, and speak for the committee as well, look very much forward to the meeting in Den Haag in a few weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for taking time away from the beach or for whatever else you have planned this week. And certainly thank you for taking the time after the first of the year to meet with us in The Hague. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Already I can tell from the questions and comments that you've shared today online that we have a very rich and rewarding discussion ahead of us. So I thank you for your participation. And if there's anything further that comes up between now and then, I think everybody knows how to reach out to Tom. You certainly can reach out to any individual committee member as well, and we'll do our best to address any questions or concerns that you may have. So with that, thank you. Have a happy holiday season. We'll see you in the new year.